Okay, now it looks like we are on the starting page. Can you see that?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, terrific. So thank you, Ellie, for having me today. I've done some of my own family research at the Carnegie Library, so I'm excited to give something back here. And I also appreciate people who are watching when it's draft weekend. And I know there's a lot going on in Pittsburgh. So I'm going to talk about Sarah B. Cochran's life, which has been fascinating people recently for three reasons. It's almost a cinematic story. It remains relevant in our era, and it's kind of a developing story in the sense that there's still information out there about her to be found. In the process of hearing her story, you'll see why she and the Cochran family remained relatively unknown compared to their business competitor, Henry Clay Frick. But you'll also see how Sarah's story offers the world a different image and perspective on subjects that we already thought we knew well, like the Gilded Age, capitalism, philanthropy, and women in Pennsylvania. After that, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the family history and genealogy component of this and local history, in case anyone who's watching is interested in telling someone's story or using those research methods to tell someone's story. And like Ellie said, we'll have time for Q&A afterward. I'm happy to revisit anything if you'd like more information. So one of the things I have learned is that Sarah Cochran is one of those people who can't really be found unless you already know she's there. And I knew about her because my family was connected to Western Pennsylvania, and I knew that we were related. After the American Revolution, ancestors started moving to southwestern Pennsylvania, and in 1969, my parents got married and moved to New Jersey, where my dad was going to be a professor. So I was born and raised in New Jersey, in the Princeton area. And I grew up visiting family and friends in Fayette County and the Pittsburgh area. And some of these trips were almost monthly. So the area that I'm talking about is shown here. I've circled Dawson. If you've ever biked the Great Allegheny Passage, if you've been to Fort Necessity or Falling Water, that's the general area that I'm focusing on. Now, my family always knew that Sarah was my great great grandmother's cousin, and that Sarah put my grandmother through college in 1917. And in this image, my great grandmother, is sitting in this window here on the left side. She was at Indiana Normal School, which is now part of IUP. And although she passed away when I was 4, I have very fond memories of her, but I never really got to discuss any family history with her or her experience in college, which would have been interesting to have for this book. Now, on trips to visit Fayette County, I grew up seeing the mansion that Sarah built, which is Linden Hall, and it's shown in this photo by John Price. You used to be able to take docent-led tours of it in the 80s and 90s, so I got to take a few of those. We also had a connection to the Cochran Church in Dawson, which is shown here. I was baptized there. My parents were married there. Grandparents were trustees. Great-grandparents were married in the parsonage. And I even had my own daughter baptized there after she was born. It's where family weddings and Christmas Eve services were. And I think having a connection to an actual place was helpful in feeling a greater connection to Sarah and her work, and as well as a sense of pride in what she did and a sense of gratitude. But it also meant that I grew up taking for granted that women did these kinds of things. So when I brought my husband to Western Pennsylvania for his first visit there after we were married, I showed him these places, and he suggested that I write a Wikipedia entry about Sarah because he couldn't find any information about her online when he Googled her. And I thought this was a great idea because then other people could add to it. And I started to do some research. I published an entry, and then I kept going to write some guest blog posts about her. And I learned that the accomplishments that were known in Fayette County were only the tip of the iceberg. For example, when I learned that a fraternity house in Morgantown, West Virginia was named for her, I knew that I had to do more research on her. So at the time, I happened to be home to raise my daughter, who was almost 2 years old. And I had some time for an unusual project. And I decided that I could spend 3 years on this, 1 year researching, 1 year writing, and then 1 year publishing, which would have been in 2021. And here we are in 2026, and we're still talking about Sarah Cochran and her story and her community. So, who was this woman? She was born Sarah Boyd Moore in a log house in Fayette County in 1857, and her parents were so poor that they may not have even owned the land that they farmed. There's a story that Sarah and one of her sisters shared a dress and each wore it on alternating days so that they could attend school on alternating days. And I think that says something about the level of poverty that she came from, but also about this drive to get a basic education, even for daughters, because there were certainly families at that time who might have only cared about educating their sons. Sarah lived from 1857 until 1936. And in addition to living through the Civil War and World War I, much of her life overlapped the women's suffrage movement, the Married Women's Property Rights Acts, because she was just born 9 years after the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, it also overlapped with the development of Pennsylvania's coal and coke industries, places where she couldn't have expected to work, but like the suffrage movement, they would profoundly affect her life. As a young woman, she wouldn't have had many prospects for her future because of her gender and her family's financial background. So she got a job as a maid in the home of Jim Cochran, and that was a step that changed the trajectory of her life. Jim Cochran isn't necessarily a household name. Certainly, he's not as well known as Frick in places like New York and New Jersey. But he was a very wealthy mine owner and coke operator by the time Sarah became his maid. He had created the Connellsville coke industry years earlier when he was a young man. And if anyone is watching from outside of a coal region, coke is a byproduct of coal, and it's made by heating it in these ovens that are shown in the bottom right corner of the screen for 24 to 72 hours at extremely high temperatures, and it's reduced to almost pure carbon, and then that is sold to steel makers because it helps create heat in the steel making process. Coke is essentially invisible to the end user of steel, but it's a very important product to be used to make steel. So it's also a very lucrative product, or at least at that time it was. So as the story goes locally, Jim Cochran, as a young man, and his relatives mined their own coal. They used a local coke oven to create some coke. Jim built a boat of his own and boated that coke to Cincinnati, where he sold it to a man named Miles Greenwood. And this was the very first time Connellsville coke was ever sold commercially. So this was the start of an industry. In Pittsburgh, Jim was sometimes associated with pollution from the coal and coke industry, but in Fayette County, he was known for bringing infrastructure to the area, electricity, bridges, railroads. He was also known for living in the town and investing in it. So he was very well liked there. And he was grooming his oldest son, Philip, to get involved and take over the family business. Now, Philip was the same age as the Cochran's young competitor, Henry Clay Frick. And both Philip and Henry Clay Frick happened to study at Otterbein University in Westerville, Ohio. Not exactly at the same time, but they did both attend that college. Frick grew up just a few miles away from the Dawson area in Westmoreland County, in the Broadford area. So, you know, I don't know how they would have run into each other in the 1880s, but in the 1980s, when I was visiting that area, you would have run into someone from that area at the mall or at certain restaurants. So it's not as if they're not going to interact. Now, Philip left college to help with the growing family business, and when he was there, he happened to fall in love with Sarah Moore, the maid. And they got married in 1879 and then had one child, James, a year later. You can imagine that in the Gilded Age, the maid might not have been the first person people would have assumed a young coal magnate in his early 30s and on his way up in the business world should marry, but he did. Now, early in the marriage, Philip remained active in the family business. And sometimes I'm asked if the Cochrans and Frick interacted in business. And Frick can actually give us the best answer. He wrote a brief letter to Andrew Carnegie in 1888, detailing how he'd like to take over the Connellsville coke industry. And he essentially didn't have very nice things to say about several competitors in the Connellsville region, but then went on to say that Jim Cochran was, quote, very vain, called the Nestor of the Coke region, has 6 ignorant sons who think they know all about the Coke business. Had a talk with Cochran on Friday and we'll see him again this week. So yes, they did interact with each other. Around this time, we might assume that Sarah's primary responsibility was taking care of her child, and it probably was. But she and her mother-in-law, Clarissa Houston Cochran, appear with Jim and Philip Cochran on deeds for the sale of several mining operations in the 1880s. So that seems to indicate that on some level, they were involved or at least aware of the business operations. And I grew up hearing that Philip was chastised for bringing Sarah into the business, but it's difficult to really find information about to what extent he did this or when this happened. Now, in 1894, Jim Cochran died, so Philip took over the family business, but only for 5 years. And then he passed away at about age 50 in 1899. At that time, he would have been in his 20th year of marriage. And certainly, if you've been married to someone for 20 years, you understand your spouse's business acumen. And the wording in his will suggests this. In that will, he left 1/3 of his estate to Sarah and gave her control of the other 2/3 for the 2 years until their son's 21st birthday, when those 2/3 would pass to the son. Sarah was named as the sole executrix and, according to the document, quote, in full charge, care, and control. There's no mention of attorneys such as Philip's cousin, M.M. Cochran, male relatives like those, quote unquote, ignorant sons who think they know so much about coal and coke, or any other male relatives. So it's interesting that the wording says something about Philip's ideas, about Sarah's business acumen, and it's significant at this time because business was considered to really be a man's world at the turn of the century, and a woman was really considered to belong in her home unless her husband wasn't financially successful. Now, Philip's death meant that Sarah was widowed at 42. Almost 2 years later, in March of 1901, her son James, who's shown on the left here, was studying business at the University of Pennsylvania, and he was also playing on the football team, and he had pledged Phi Kappa Psi there. And he got a cold that turned into pneumonia, and it looked like he would get better, and then he didn't. He actually passed away 6 months before his 21st birthday. And looking back on that, it raises questions about where the Cochran family and its businesses and name recognition might have gone if he had lived a more normal lifespan. But this turn of events left Sarah a 44-year-old widow with no living children, no living parents or parents-in-law. And she described this as a time of overwhelming grief and said that, quote, her tears fell unceasingly. We'll return to her grief later, but I was 44 at the time I was starting to work on this book, and I had already had a business career and only recently had a daughter. So I wondered what place or value such a woman might have had in society at the turn of the century. Well, she made her own place in the world. With these two tragic deaths, she owned a business portfolio that included coal mines, coking facilities, and interests in railroads and banks in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Virginia, and Tennessee. The business environment was difficult. Homestead had just happened in the 1890s, and there had been an assassination attempt on Henry Clay Frick. And it was even made illegal for women and girls to work in or around Pennsylvania coal mines. And some miners thought that a woman's presence there would be unlucky. But nonetheless, Sarah stayed in the industry until she died. And this raises a lot of questions. Did she feel obligated to remain in the industry? Had she looked forward to passing the 2/3 of the estate to James, or did she enjoy competing in business? With few of her own words on the subject, we know that she had to fight to get Philip's cousin, M.M. Cochran, who was a respected attorney and I think even a district attorney at one point in Fayette County, into certain roles that her son would have had. So it's kind of interesting to consider how the two of them navigated. He was a member of the Duquesne Club at the time, which would have been closed to Sarah and any woman. And it raises questions about whether they might have had a strategy for which one of them dealt with certain issues or people or organizations. Having been a woman in business myself, I wanted to know how Sarah navigated the day-to-day and how involved she was with decisions. Was she taken seriously? And it's hard to find business information that answers those questions, at least so far. But one example that I found was her presence as the only woman at a smoker given in 1904 by one of the managers of her companies, and it was for the mining and railroad and banking men in Dawson. And it was covered by the local newspaper, and her presence was explained as being there to provide some pleasant conversation. Now, I grew up hearing that Henry Clay Frick thought of the business as Philip's, even though Philip had passed on. Sarah was still a woman, and I don't know that that perspective, if true, would even have been unique to any one person. It seems to be more the view of that era. So Sarah stayed in the industry into her 70s, regardless of who people thought the business belonged to. But we wouldn't know this if we just look at public records. So when she was a business leader, this is the census record that shows her occupation as nun. And some other census records leave a blank space for her occupation or just employer. If we read later oral histories of company towns, the information usually is provided by Frick employees, so there's no mention of any Cochrans. There's some scholarship about women in mining communities, but they're usually miners' wives, so that doesn't include Sarah. And she's also left out of Pennsylvania's official mining reports because at most those name mine managers, not the owners and directors. So outside of a small area, she's been invisible as a very unexpected example of a Gilded Age industrialist. Meanwhile, Henry Clay Frick, occupation capitalist in the census, became the name associated with the Connellsville coke industry because his company aligned with Andrew Carnegie and grew by acquisition over the years. And eventually it eclipsed all of his competitors. So there were male competitors from that area who no one has heard of widely. But he even eclipsed the Cochrans like Jim Cochran, who pioneered that particular industry a generation earlier. Our image of Frick suggests that he's one of the industry's elders, but I think Jim Cochran might have disagreed with that. Now, if we can't find so much information about Sarah's business experience, her philanthropy presents a much better paper trail. At the turn of the century, it was socially acceptable for women to be philanthropists. And it makes sense that as a coal magnate's wife, she would be a philanthropist. But she had also grown up in poverty. So how did she become such a great philanthropist? Well, we have to return to her grief. In a 1935 letter, she said that during her grieving process, A doctor advised her to think of the schools and churches she could aid, and she took that advice to heart. And she said that she found new light in the world and new trust in God by doing good. So, from a numbers standpoint, her philanthropy can be quantified. We can break it down into quiet philanthropy that doesn't have much of a paper trail. Examples would be putting people through college or buying musical instruments, which I learned about after the book. She enjoyed music, and if someone didn't have the money to buy, say, a violin and wanted to learn how to buy it, she would just buy it for them. Then she had public philanthropy, like donations to universities that got recorded in college bulletins and newspapers or on names of buildings or endowed chairs. When she died in 1936, her quiet philanthropy was estimated to be about hundreds of thousands of dollars, and her public philanthropy was estimated to be worth about $2 million. So today, that's more than $43 million of philanthropy. The examples of her philanthropy that I found were always related to her Methodist faith, causes that mattered to her, like education and suffrage, and her family. So we can generally find that philanthropy concentrated in the geographic locations where she had connections, like Western Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, which means that she didn't seem to actively try to make a name for herself through philanthropic ventures. And she wasn't going out to other locations so that more people would be aware of her. Her philanthropy helped to shift power in some cases. So, an example would be my great grandmother. Sarah invested in people so that they could have the skills to get better jobs and live better lives rather than continuing to depend on her. So, putting people through college would be one of those examples. Now, these are examples of her educational philanthropy, and I would be excited to say that I had done just one of these bullet points, but she was very productive in her life, and she was a fraternity house namesake for the West Virginia Alpha chapter of Phi Kappa Psi. This is the fraternity that her son had pledged at the University of Pennsylvania. She even became the mom of that chapter, and would have the brothers over for lawn games and snacks and music. And I have to believe she was also helping these guys with networking if they wanted to get into railroads, banking, mining, whatever. This is the women's dormitory that she built at Otterbein University to memorialize her husband. It's no longer standing after a fire in the 1970s. It was razed. And this portrait on the right was in that building. It's now at Courtright Memorial Library at Otterbein. And I'm really excited about this particular painting because I was able to work with Otterbein to get it into the exhibit at the Heinz History Center 2 years ago called A Woman's Place. So you might have seen that there if you were in Pittsburgh in 2024. This is Cochran Hall at Allegheny College, which is still standing. And this is a photo from 2019 that I took. And she built this in memory of her son. It was for men at the time. And the president of the college recognized Sarah and Andrew Carnegie as the most influential donors to the college during the period when this building was constructed. So in that community, she was being mentioned in the same breath as Carnegie, even though she was more of a regional philanthropist. The building was actually the most expensive one on campus at the time, so in a way, she outdid Andrew Carnegie. At home in Dawson, she built the Philip G. Cochran Memorial Methodist Episcopal Church to memorialize her husband in 1900. The town was about 30 years old and it was wealthy. It was the home to mining managers. It wasn't a company town, and it had mine offices and opera houses. And the Cochran Church needed to look like it belonged in such a town. It even had its own Tiffany window that's shown here, and that would have been very fashionable at the time. So during a 1905 trip to Europe, she was also able to buy a copy of Raphael's Sistine Madonna that was painted by a Dresden artist called L. Storm. And this was actually part of a commission that was initiated in the 1800s by Jane Stanford. It involved American diplomats and the Kaiser. And according to some news reports, the artist refused to sell this to Andrew Carnegie. But when Sarah visited, the artist had just passed away and the estate was being settled, and she was able to buy it for a couple of $1,000s. So, as the Connellsville Courier very bluntly put it, as if they were trolling Andrew Carnegie, Mrs. Cochran succeeded where Mr. Carnegie failed. Now, in the 1920s, Sarah revisited the Cochran Church in Dawson and worked with the architect Thomas Pringle to build an even bigger Gothic-style church to memorialize her husband and her son. It still operates today. You can see the Sistine Madonna copy in it and the Tiffany window. But it also has these beautiful stained glass windows that are designed by Henry Hunt. So it's a very unexpected little architectural gem in a railroad town on the Yauk, and it's actually on the National Register of Historic Places for Architecture. And speaking of that, her European travels informed some of her decisions for the design of her mansion, Linden Hall, just a few miles outside of Dawson. This is a recent photo in the bottom right by John Price. The mansion was dedicated in 1913 and it sat on about 600 acres in the mountains of Fayette County. And the linden trees are supposed to be a reference to Unter den Linden in Berlin. And she's said to have gotten design ideas while traveling in England. So locals were still telling the story when I was growing up of how she had employed Italian stonemasons to do work on this. And after they finished the work, she offered to sponsor them for American citizenship. We don't know how many people took her up on that. It would make for an interesting oral history project for a local history organization. But in the 1980s, it was also added to the National Register of Historic Places for Architectural Significance, and it's been owned by the United Steelworkers since the 1970s. So pay special attention to this three-part window over the door here, because we're going to talk about that. Sarah commissioned Tiffany Studios to create a stained glass window when this house was under construction. The story is that it was supposed to depict her garden in full bloom, and it was designed by Agnes Northrop at Tiffany Studios and crafted by the women called the Tiffany Girls at the studio. I was able to see that window when it was still in situ at Linden Hall, and it was stunning, even without specialized knowledge of Tiffany windows. It was sold to a private collector about 20 years ago, and I assumed it wouldn't be seen again. But in 2023, the Metropolitan Museum of Art acquired it and installed it. And I was invited to meet the curator of American Decorative Arts while she was doing research on the window and Linden Hall and Sarah Cochran. And I'm happy to say that research from my book was used in the installation, and I was invited to the unveiling in November of 2024, which was just wonderful. Nani Frelinghuysen, who's the curator, visited Linden Hall and Dawson and the Cochran Church as part of her research, which I thought was just great that she was able to see those places. And I know people in Dawson were so excited that she made the trip. So it was actually in the winter 2025-2026 Metropolitan Museum of Art Bulletin, which you can read for free online. The images in it are just fantastic with close-ups. And there's a video on the Met's Instagram that's wonderful too, and it's been covered in the magazine Antiques, January, February of 2025. So if you're interested in that, there's a lot of information circulating right now. And I hope you'll visit it at the Met the next time you're in New York in the American Wing. Now, that previous image showed the beauty of the window. This gives you an idea of the scale. That's my husband and daughter over on the right. And now it's on a postcard, so that's me holding the postcard in front of the Met. So this is why it's called monumental in the art world. And I think in Fayette County, we knew that it was just stunning and monumental years ago. So that's been really wonderful to be involved with that. I started going to the Met when I was 12, and it's my favorite museum in the world. So I'm just delighted that it's there. Now, some people might look at the window and interpret Sarah's commission as, someone who has too much money on her hands if she's commissioning a stained glass version of a view from her own existing window. But that's really not the case. At a time when a woman's place was considered to be in the home, Sarah used her home to engage with the world in ways that exerted influence and sometimes shifted power again. For example, she hosted all of the Methodist bishops of the world here for their 10-day semi-annual meeting in 1916. It was the first time this meeting was held in a private residence. This is the invitation to a reception that she hosted at the end of it for about 500 people from Western Pennsylvania and all of the bishops. And then on the right, you can see the program of services for another event connected with that meeting. H.J. Hines reportedly attended lunch there with the bishops, and that was covered in the newspaper. So that was an interesting find. It's hard to talk about Linden Hall without discussing Sarah's suffrage activism, which was actually lost to history. It's something no one has talked about. For context, Pennsylvania was going to have a referendum on women's suffrage in November 1915. So as a run-up to that, throughout the year, there were numerous suffrage fundraisers around the state. And it was so important that Anna Howard Shaw would go and speak at these fundraisers for free. You might have also heard about the Justice Bell tour that was traveling around every county in the state that year. So it was a really big deal. And Sarah was involved with her local suffrage organization. And in July 1915, she opened Linden Hall for a fundraiser. It was called a tea in some newspapers and a fundraiser or rally in the other. So you can see on the left how the mansion and photos of the interior and exterior were meant to draw people's attention. And it looks almost like something you would see in social media today to get people excited about an event. So everybody was invited, and whether curiosity about suffrage or this big brand new house drew people, newspapers reported that 500 or 600 people attended, and they paid $1 each, which is about $30 today, to attend it. So, you could say that it was successful to get that many people involved. It was called to order with a potato masher as a gavel because in Western Pennsylvania, anti-suffragists said that enfranchised women wouldn't remain domestic. So this was reassurance that they would. Anna Howard Shaw spoke here. It's documented in her diary at the Schlesinger Library. We can't find a copy of her speech, and she doesn't seem to use the same speech repeatedly. So there's references to what she talked about, but not the actual text of it. And since I published the book, I was sent this photo from the Woman's Journal. This came from Amanda Owen at the Justice Bell Foundation. And it's a photo taken on the day of the rally in Sarah's garden with Sarah on the left, Anna Howard Shaw, Alice Kiernan, who was the head of suffrage from Somerset County, Pennsylvania, and M.M. Cochran, that cousin of Phillips, who was a DA and I believe, a trustee at Bethany College as well. So it's odd to see them all in one picture. When I started this project, a cousin told me that he had never even seen Sarah's picture, so it's been really lucky to find so many. Now, we could say that this rally was a success, but ultimately suffrage lost in Pennsylvania in the referendum, but the majority of Western Pennsylvania supported it. Now, while Linden Hall was a great location for a suffrage fundraiser for practical reasons, this rally would have brought that man's world of politics straight into the home, which was the place traditionally considered a woman's world. So if there was ever a line separating a woman's place in the home from the man's place in the outside world, it got blurred or removed with this rally. And it leads us to wonder if part of being a woman meant that Sarah was required to be a philanthropist and an activist in a way that her male peers were not. This is an image of Sarah that ran in the newspaper the day after that rally. It's one of my favorites. I think it's beautiful, but it's also worth considering for other reasons. She's shown in profile, and if you were printing money, an image like this is what you would want to use. She has the dignity of a monarch or a head of state, and she's visibly feminine and wealthy with what looks like pearl jewelry and hair in a bun. So that counters visually any anti-suffragists' arguments about, whether or not women would be feminine after they got the vote. This woman, who's the farmer's daughter and the businesswoman and the college trustee and the philanthropist, is an American citizen here with the dignity of a founding father. Now, she was known for being democratic and looking for value in people rather than titles. And to that end, she was infirmed in her last years because she was helping staff move porch furniture during a storm. And when she passed away in October of 1936, her memorial service was at the Cochran Church in Dawson, and it could have been about anything, but it was titled The Ministry of Woman. Again, we don't have any text from that, but it's just a very interesting subject to have there. And it's also interesting to note that about a month later, M.M. Cochran passed away. Now, when I worked on this book, one of my things was that there's a tremendous opportunity for genealogists and people with an interest in local history or family history to bring obscure people and historical figures to larger audiences and possibly to the larger historical narrative. So if you're working on a local history project or a family history project, these are some learnings that I can share with you. So first of all, I grew up associating Sarah just with Fayette County, but she was also associated with Morgantown and Otterbein University and Allegheny College. So one thing that I would consider in a project is how local is the local history, or how many localities might be involved. People with an interest in the story, or even to find more information while you're doing research. My background is not in history academically, as was mentioned earlier. So my historical research methods came from my experience in genealogical research and also in resources that I had used for that. So wills played a big part in proving what people thought of each other or how certain things were handled in this particular person's life. Newspaper articles were just a treasure trove of information. And the census, of course, was helpful in seeing how Sarah was or wasn't recorded. But I even went to the non-population census, which I'd never really had a reason to use in genealogy. But it was so helpful for seeing how the region was moving toward coal production and how productive these family farms were at the time. I also found that I used the FAN method of friends, acquaintances, and neighbors, or friends and neighbors, to try to find more information about Sarah, because there's not a repository of information about her. Some people know some different pieces of information. Someone used to have some business records, but he passed away and no one knows where those records are. So I had to look for people that Sarah interacted with, like H.J. Hines, and do research on them and see if I could come up with additional information about her that way. And then lastly, the rigor of having to document and prove the information that you're finding. I think for me, it was good to have had that experience proving lineages for lineage clubs. And I was able to take something from that to the research that I did for this book. Now, in historic preservation, I mentioned the National Register of Historic Places for both the Cochran Church and Linden Hall, and those applications were fantastic resources to look for. They were accessible online at the time, and they had pictures, they had floor plans, they had essentially a bibliography and information from people who put this together in the 1980s about who the architects were, who designed things, and just all different information. I also turned to the Historic American Buildings Survey and the Historic American Engineering Record for some information about company towns that I couldn't find in other places. So that was helpful in the same way as the National Register applications. Archives were just wonderful. Archivists were extremely helpful in locating records, but also saying, oh, if you're doing this project about this topic, have you read this book or do you know this person's research? And I think sometimes we forget how the depth of resources that exist in archives. So that's something else that I would say. I didn't use oral history in this particular project because I feel like it's a very challenging area to work in. I was advised by an attorney in New Jersey that if I wanted to use oral history, I would need to get an attorney to write up a release. I would need to get people who were going to talk, to be quoted, to sign that release. And then I would need to show those people what I wrote before publication. And the danger in that is that if you can't get in touch with those people, again, before publication, you can't really use the information according to this legal advice. So if you are working on a particular time schedule, like I was, you have to consider whether or not you want to get involved with oral history and whether it makes sense. There are places where it would be great to do that. Like I said earlier, trying to identify people who worked at Linden Hall or descendants of the Italian stonemasons would be great for oral history projects. But I also think it's a project that might make sense to do with an organization who can help with recording interviews and getting the right sign-offs from participants. Now, I've started to make a habit of donating some of my records and artifacts to organizations in Western Pennsylvania and elsewhere because I have these put away very carefully in acid-free boxes in a special genealogy closet, but I'm the only person who knows that they're there. And I think they would be helpful to people in other areas who might want to research industry in Western Pennsylvania or in the Gilded Age or women's labor or Methodism in Western Pennsylvania. So I've started donating these, and I recommend that to other people because we just need to get that information accessible. How do we share local history more broadly, at least in this project? I thought about how Sarah's story would be accessible. And when I thought about donating things like these artifacts and papers that I had, I thought about how other people might find her if they didn't already know her name, they didn't know anything about Dawson or Fayette County or her industry. So I donated to local organizations in Western Pennsylvania, regional, but also looked at some national organizations too, so that she's accessible on all of these different levels. I've talked about her on podcasts and in articles, some radio and social media. And then there have been some niche opportunities. We talked about the Metropolitan Museum of Art and how that's leading to opportunities for people to learn about her through visiting the Met or reading its publications. But I also reached out to the Organization for Laurel Highlands Tourism, and Eric Knopfsnyder, who is there, wrote a wonderful article about Sarah and the places that she was associated with in Fayette County for its blog. So tourism and heritage tourism are other areas that I think would have an interest in historical figures from a particular area. One that was a rather odd niche was board games. My husband loves board games, and he happened to find out that this board game called Votes for Women was being developed. So I reached out to the company that was producing it and told them about Sarah Cochran and was actually able to get her listed or mentioned on one of the playing cards for the games. And that's the picture of it right there. So she's mentioned with Alva Vanderbilt. I pointed them to a newspapers.com article about Sarah's suffrage rally so they could do the research, and there she is. In the end, I'm trying to avoid being the one person who owns Sarah Cochran's story because it's not very effective if other people are looking for information, whether it's to write a newspaper article about her or to do academic research. They need to be able to find her without knowing that they have to go to me. So I think that's something else to consider if you're working with a particular local history subject. How will people from other parts of the country or the world find this and get information quickly? And sometimes having that information in museums and archives helps them in their work.